Have you ever wondered what makes the US Open one of the most electrifying tennis tournaments in the world? Well, from its historic roots to its dazzling matches under the New York City lights, the US Open is a spectacle like no other. So today, we're diving into the most interesting and lesser known facts about this iconic event. Let's go. Historic roots. The tournament was first held way back in 1881, and it was held at the Newport Casino in Newport, Rhode Island. Curiously, it was held on grass courts at that time, which today is most associated with the Wimbledon tennis tournament. It seems strange to think of the US Open with grass courts, but that's indeed how it started, and there's much more on that to come. The inaugural tournament was won by a man named Richard Sears, and not only did he win the first tournament, he won the first 7 tournaments. This was partially because he was an outstanding tennis player, but it was also heavily assisted by the fact that under the rules at the time, the champion was given an automatic berth into next year's finals. So yeah, that definitely helped. Women players at the US Open. Now, if you have even a casual familiarity with sports around the world, it won't surprise you that women haven't always been as involved as they should have been, and that's me saying it nicely. But I'm happy to report that the US Open was much quicker to bring women into the championships than many other global sports. The first women's championship was held in 1887, just 6 years after the first men's championship. It was competed at the Philadelphia Cricket Club, and it was, at the time, known as the U.S. Women's Singles National Championship. Remarkably, the first women's title was won by Ellen Hansel, a native Philadelphian, playing on her own home turf. What made it even more remarkable was that she was just 17 years old at the time. Incredible stuff. The move to New York. Now, the astute viewer will note that the men's championships were in Rhode Island and the women's championships were in Philadelphia. Neither of those are, in fact, New York City, where the tournament is hosted today. So how did it get there? The first taste of the Big Apple came in 1888 and 1889 when the men's doubles championship was played at the Staten Island Cricket Club in New York. From there, momentum began to build for moving the tournament to New York full-time. These efforts were headed by notable New Yorker, competitive tennis player, wealthy banker, and Titanic survivor Carl Baer. The Titanic thing has nothing to do with this, I just found it really interesting. Anyway, things really began to gain steam in the early 1910s, and by 1915, the national championships were moved to the West Side Tennis Club in the Forest Hills area of Queens, New York. However, this was far from a clean, cut and dried issue, as the vote to move the tournament was 128 in favor and 119 against. And while the men's tournament was moved to New York City in 1915, the women's tournament was still held in Philadelphia, and it didn't move to New York until 1921. The Open era. Ever wondered why it's called the US Open? Well, it's quite important for the tournament, though it came about decades after the tournament was first created. The Open era kicked off in 1968, as this was the first time entry standards were opened up and professional tennis players were allowed to play in the tournament. Up until this point, only amateurs were allowed to play, and professionals, i.e. people who made money playing tennis, were barred from competing. This may seem quaint in hindsight, but anyone familiar with the early days of stuff like the Olympics will know that this was a very common theme across the sports world. So starting in 1968, all of the championships other than the mixed doubles events were opened up to both pros and amateurs. That year, 96 men and 63 women entered the tournament, and the prize money was set at a total of $100,000. It's one of tennis's Grand Slams. Many sports have the concept of the Grand Slam, which is a series of tournaments that are basically considered a bigger deal than the others on the annual schedule. In tennis, there are 4 Grand Slam tournaments: the Australian Open, the French Open, Wimbledon, and the US Open. Even though it was always considered a super important championship, the US Open was not actually designated as one of the major tournaments until 1924. And over the decades, many players have completed a career Grand Slam. Select few, though, have achieved it all in one calendar year, but it has happened. On the men's side, this has been achieved by American Don Budge in 1938 and Australian Rod Laver in 1962. And because he was awesome, Rod Laver did it again in 1969. What a beast. 3 women have achieved the calendar year Grand Slam, specifically Maureen Connolly in 1953, Margaret Court in 1970, and most recently Steffi Graf in 1988. Margaret Court, by the way, also achieved this in the mixed doubles. Unreal. US Open firsts. In the history of tennis, the US Open has actually been a trailblazer with quite a few notable firsts to its credit, both on and off the court. In 1970, it became the first Grand Slam tennis tournament to use a tiebreaker to decide a set that reached 6-6, something which has become increasingly common as the years went on. It was also one of the first tournaments to adapt its courts to be more TV friendly, including a switch of the surface of the court itself to make it easier for the viewer starting in 1975. As mentioned, more on that to come. In 2006, it was the first Grand Slam tennis tournament to introduce instant replay reviews of its line calls. And perhaps most notably, it became the first Grand Slam tennis tournament to award equal prize money to men and women. This began in 1973. That year's winners, John Newcombe and Margaret Court, each received $25,000. The National Tennis Center. As mentioned, the US Open was played at the West Side Tennis Club for some time, but as the events grew bigger and bigger, the championships needed a new home. And in 1978, the whole thing moved to the USTA National Tennis Center in Flushing Meadows, Queens, New York. This complex is just 3 miles or just under 5 kilometers from the old West Side Tennis Club. During the 2006 US Open, the entire complex was renamed the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center in honor of Billie Jean King, a 4-time US Open women's champion and one of the early pioneers in women's tennis. The main court is known as Arthur Ashe Stadium, named for Arthur Ashe, member of the International Tennis Hall of Fame and winner of the very first Open Championship in 1968. It holds a whopping 23,771 people. It's huge. The court surfaces. Remember how I mentioned that this tournament was originally played on grass courts and that they did a surface change to make it more TV friendly? Well, all of that is true, but it's even more interesting than that. So as mentioned, the tournament started on grass, and for a very long time it was on grass, from its founding in 1881 all the way up until 1974, just like at Wimbledon. And then for a few years they switched to clay courts. Yes, clay courts like the French Open. From 1975 to 1977, these championships were on clay. The stereotypical hard courts that we all associate with the US Open today didn't actually kick in until 1978. That's pretty recent. Here is your fun fact of the day. American Jimmy Connors is the only person in history to win the US Open on all 3 court surfaces. He won it on grass in 1974, on clay in 1976, and on the hard courts 3 times in 1978, 1982, and 1983. That is a wild bit of trivia. Another fun fact about the hard court surface, the color of blue that the courts are painted is actually a trademark color called US Open Blue. It's not the most clever name, I gotta say, but hey, it's at least accurate. The prize money. I mentioned earlier that in 1973, the men's and women's singles champions were awarded the same prize money, and those 2 winners each received $25,000. But suffice to say, that dollar amount's gone up a little bit since then. Regarding the total prize pool for the entire tournament as of 2023, it stood at $65 million. That was the largest sum ever in a tennis tournament. It's a gargantuan amount. The winners of the men's and women's singles championships still get the same amount of money, and they each got $3 million. The runner-up got $1.5 million, the semifinalists got $775,000 each, and it goes down from there. It actually ain't that bad if you think about it. If you go to all the way down the bracket, you actually would have won $81,000 just for making it to the round of 128. I'm not saying that's easy at all, but that's some decent coin for coming in the top 128. Another lesser known fact is that the players actually also receive a per diem amount for hotel rooms, meals, and other items, and this includes a provision for racket stringing services. That makes sense. Tournament records. There are too many possible records to list out there, but I'll fire off some of the ones that I found most interesting. The guy who won the very first championship, Richard Sears, is tied for the most total wins with 7. He also holds the record for the most consecutive championship wins, the most doubles titles, the most consecutive double titles, and probably the best tennis outfit of all time. On the women's side, the record for singles play is 8 championships, held by Norwegian-American Mola Mallory. She also has the distinction of being the first woman to represent Norway at the Olympics. That's cool. But the record for the most total championships is insane. It's held by Margaret Osborne DuPont, who won a mind-boggling 25 total championships across singles, doubles, and mixed doubles play between 1941 and 1960. That is psychotic. Well, there you have it. That's today's video, and I hope this gets you in the mood for a little tennis. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, game, set, and match.